an American flag, an international warrant, and the history Mamdani chose to erase. A reflection on Mayor Zohran Mamdani's July 22 address. Mayor Zohran Mamdani delivered his message seated before an American flag. Yet the political and moral framework of his speech did not appear to come from American law, American foreign policy, or even a balanced account of the war he condemned. It closely followed the narrative promoted by Hamas-aligned messaging, Al Jazeera, anti-Israel United Nations officials, and the International Criminal Court. That resemblance does not prove that Hamas, Al Jazeera, or any outside organization wrote the speech. Without documentary evidence, such authorship should not be asserted as fact. But the resemblance in language, omissions, statistics, and moral framing is sufficiently striking to deserve public examination. Mamdani accused Benjamin Netanyahu of responsibility for more than 73,000 deaths, the maiming and starvation of children, attacks on hospitals and maternity centers, and the killing of journalists and humanitarian workers. He then declared that Netanyahu should be arrested and tried under an ICC warrant. What was absent from this passionate indictment was as revealing as what was included. The missing beginning. Mamdani did not mention October 7, 2023. He did not mention the Hamas invasion of Israel, the murder of civilians, the taking of hostages, the attacks on Israeli communities, or the event that triggered the present war. He did not explain that Hamas embedded itself within Gaza's civilian environment or that Israel was responding to an armed organization openly committed to its destruction. A listener unfamiliar with the history would naturally conclude that Israel simply decided to attack Gaza without provocation. This is not merely an incomplete history. It is a method of persuasion. Remove the initiating atrocity, remove Hamas, remove the hostages, and remove Israel's security concerns, and the remaining story becomes one of inexplicable Israeli cruelty toward passive victims. Mamdani's speech, therefore, did not simply condemn particular Israeli actions. It constructed a moral universe in which only one party possesses agency, only one party bears responsibility, and only one population deserves to be remembered. Casualty numbers presented as a verdict. Mamdani repeated the figure of more than 73,000 deaths, as though it were a judicially established count attributable personally and criminally to Netanyahu. He offered no explanation of the source, no distinction between civilians and combatants, no discussion of uncertainty in wartime reporting, and no acknowledgement that casualty statistics originating in Hamas-governed Gaza are politically contested. Even where civilian suffering is real and immense, statistics should not be transformed automatically into proof of an individual leader's criminal guilt. A death count does not, by itself, reveal how each person died, whether the person was a civilian or combatant, whether the death resulted from Israeli action, failed Palestinian rockets, combat around military positions, starvation, disease, or another cause. Mamdani moved directly from accusation to conviction. He repeatedly called Netanyahu a war criminal, although an ICC warrant is an accusation and authorization for arrest, not a final judgment after trial. That distinction matters most when public officials claim to be defending the rule of law. The journalists and aid workers claim. Mamdani spoke of the gunning down of hundreds of aid workers and journalists, presenting both categories as if every person identified by an employer or media organization must necessarily have been a neutral civilian. That assumption cannot safely be made. There is documented evidence that some people employed in humanitarian or educational roles were connected to Hamas or participated in October 7. In April 2026, the USAID Inspector General reported evidence linking additional current or former UNRWA employees to participation in the attacks, hostage detention, terrorist activity, or Hamas affiliation. OIG.usaid.gov. That evidence does not justify claiming that all, or even most, aid workers and journalists were Hamas participants. Nor does it excuse unlawful attacks on genuine civilians. It does, however, demonstrate why Mamdani's categorical language is misleading. Job titles cannot substitute for individual investigation, and institutional labels cannot establish innocence any more than Israeli military labels can establish guilt. A responsible official would distinguish among verified journalists, humanitarian personnel, Hamas members operating under civilian cover, and disputed cases. Mamdani did not acknowledge that complexity because complexity would weaken the emotional certainty of his message. An American mayor invoking a court America has not joined. The most disturbing part of the speech may be Mamdani's treatment of the International Criminal Court as a superior source of moral and legal authority. He acknowledged that New York City lacks independent legal authority to execute the ICC warrant. Nevertheless, he called upon the federal government to join the ICC and carry out the arrest. The United States is not a party to the Rome Statute. Congress has expressly stated that the United States is not bound by its terms, and federal law restricts governmental support for the ICC. Department of Justice. Mamdani is free to advocate changing American policy. But an American mayor should be clear that he is proposing a fundamental reversal of existing national policy, not merely asking the government to perform an already recognized legal obligation. Instead, the speech treated the ICC warrant as though it carried an authority that the United States was morally delinquent for refusing to obey. The image was difficult to overlook. An American municipal official speaking before the American flag while asking the federal government to submit to the direction of an international institution that the United States has deliberately declined to join. He is an American citizen, but he does not speak for every American. It would be factually incorrect to say that Mamdani is not an American. He is a naturalized United States citizen and has publicly described taking the oath of citizenship. Naturalized citizenship is genuine American citizenship under the law. NYC government. That fact does not mean he represents the opinions of all Americans. In the speech, Mamdani said that we as Americans pay for the bombs and concluded by presenting his position as a defense of universal humanity. Yet millions of Americans reject his characterization of the war, support Israel's right to defend itself, question the ICC's jurisdiction and credibility, and believe that any account omitting October 7th is fundamentally dishonest. He is entitled to speak as an American. He is not entitled to convert his personal ideology into the collective voice of the American people. Anti-Israel criticism or anti-Semitism. Criticism of Netanyahu, the Israeli government, or Israeli military policy is not automatically anti-Semitic. Serious accusations should not be reduced to labels merely because they concern Israel. But a pattern can become revealing. When a public official erases the massacre of Jews that began the war, ignores Israeli victims and hostages, treats Hamas-supplied or Hamas-influenced claims as unquestioned truth, singles out the Jewish state's leader for personal criminal condemnation, and elevates an international tribunal over the legal position of his own country, observers are justified in asking whether this is ordinary policy criticism or something more deeply hostile. Mamdani's speech expressed intense compassion for Palestinian suffering. It expressed none for Israelis murdered, raped, kidnapped, displaced, or still held hostage. Empathy that stops precisely at the boundary of Jewish suffering is not universal humanitarianism. It is selective humanity, the speech's real purpose. This was not a legal explanation. Mamdani admitted that the city could not make the arrest. It was not a historical explanation. The history began after October 7th. It was not an evidentiary presentation. Allegations were stated as final judgments. It was a political performance designed to place New York City morally on the side of the ICC's case against Israel and to portray disagreement as silence in the face of genocide. The American flag behind Mamdani could not supply the balance missing from his words, nor could it transform an international political narrative into American law. The public should ask who researched the speech, who selected its casualty figures, which reports were consulted, whether competing evidence was reviewed, and whether city employees or public resources were used to prepare and address advancing a foreign policy campaign outside the ordinary responsibilities of municipal government. Until those questions are answered, it would be irresponsible to claim that Hamas or Al Jazeera literally wrote the speech. But it is entirely reasonable to conclude that the speech reproduced their central narrative. Begin the story after October 7th, remove Hamas from view, treat disputed claims as established facts, deny moral complexity, and present Israel alone as the criminal party. That is not a complete account of the war. It is propaganda delivered from an American mayor's office.